The camera fades in, capturing the soft hum of a busy cafe. The sound of coffee cups clinking against saucers, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. It's the kind of place where stories are told, where memories linger in the air like the scent of freshly brewed espresso. And tonight, one story is about to be told that few have ever heard. She sits by the window, fingers lightly tracing the rim of her cup. Her eyes, deep with reflection, hold a history that hasn't been fully explored, a past intertwined with a name the world knows all too well: Barack Obama. For years, people have speculated, questioned, wondered. Who was Barack Obama before the presidency? Before the campaigns, before the White House? Who was the man behind the speeches, the policies, the history-making moments? Tonight, we step back in time, long before he became a senator, before he became President of the United States. We go back to the days when he was simply Barack, a young man navigating life, love, ambition, and identity. And she was there, beside him, part of the journey that shaped the man who would one day lead a nation. Her name has remained in the background, a footnote in history. But today, she steps forward, not to rewrite the past, but to share her truth, her perspective, what it was like to know him before the world did. This is not just a story about love. It's a story about youth, about choices, about the quiet moments that often go unnoticed but shape the course of a life. It's about the conversations that linger, the words exchanged in hushed tones, the dreams shared in the late hours of the night. It's about who he was before he became who we all know. As she takes a deep breath, the weight of time settling into her expression, we lean in waiting. What was he like? What did he dream of? What secrets does she hold that history books never captured? She glances at the camera, a small smile playing on her lips, and then she speaks. And just like that, history becomes personal. The cafe feels smaller now, as if the walls have drawn in closer, as if the moment itself is demanding our full attention. She looks down at her cup for a second, as if gathering her thoughts, deciding where to begin. There's a hesitation, a quiet moment where time seems to pause, and then she finally speaks. I met him in a way that wasn't extraordinary, she says, her voice soft but steady. But somehow, even back then, he felt like someone who was meant for something bigger. Her fingers tighten slightly around the handle of her cup as she remembers. He wasn't the Barack Obama that the world knows. He wasn't the polished speaker, the man in the suit, the leader. He was just Barack, a guy with big ideas, a guy who thought deeply about everything, sometimes too deeply. He could sit for hours, talking about things that most people wouldn't even think about: books, philosophy, race, identity. He questioned everything, and sometimes it felt like he was trying to figure himself out while figuring out the whole world at the same time. There's a flicker of something in her eyes, nostalgia maybe, or something heavier. We were young, she continues, and when you're young, you think you have all the time in the world. You think the people in your life will always be there. But looking back, I realize now that he was always on a path to somewhere else, somewhere far beyond anything I could have imagined at the time. She pauses, her fingers tracing the edge of the napkin in front of her. But back then, we were just two people in a city that felt too big for us sometimes. We walked everywhere, through the streets, through bookstores, through parks. He loved bookstores. He could get lost in them. And I would just watch him, pulling out books, flipping through pages like he was looking for something, but he never quite found it. A small, wistful smile tugs at the corner of her lips. I remember this one time. I don't know why it sticks with me, but it does. We were sitting outside at this little cafe. It was late, one of those warm summer nights, and he was reading something, James Baldwin, I think, and he suddenly looked up at me and said, "Do you ever feel like you're standing in between two worlds?" She shakes her head slightly, as if she can still hear his voice, still feel the weight of that question. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but now looking back, I see it. He was always caught between things, between where he came from and where he was going, between expectations and dreams, between different parts of himself. And maybe that's what made him who he was. Maybe that's what made him so different. Her voice softens, almost like she's speaking more to herself now than to anyone else. But I also think it made things complicated. The way she says it, complicated, it lingers. There's something unspoken in that word, something unfinished. She exhales slowly, running a hand through her hair, lost in thought for a moment. Then, as if remembering where she is, she straightens slightly, her expression shifting just a little. "You have to understand," she says, her tone more certain now. He wasn't someone who just lived in the moment. He was always thinking ahead, always moving forward. Even when we were together, it felt like part of him was already somewhere else. There's a brief silence, heavy with things left unsaid. And I think I knew, even then, that he wasn't mine to keep. The cafe seems quieter now. The sounds of the city outside feel distant, like they belong to another world. She takes a sip of her coffee, as if letting the moments settle before she continues. "There was this one night," she says, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I ever told anyone about it, but it's something I'll never forget." She looks up, meeting the camera's gaze directly for the first time. And just like that, the story pulls us in deeper. The air in the cafe feels heavier now, as if the weight of the past has settled between us. She looks down, fingers brushing absently against the rim of her cup, lost in thought. Then she takes a breath, steadying herself, before continuing. "It was late," she says, her voice quieter now. "One of those nights where the city feels too big, too empty. We had been walking for a while, no real destination, just moving. He always liked to walk when he had something on his mind. And that night, I could tell something was weighing on him." Her gaze drifts slightly, as if she's seeing the memory unfold right in front of her. "I asked him what was wrong. At first, he didn't say anything. Just kept walking, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. And then finally, he stopped. He turned to me and said, 'Sometimes, I feel like I'm living two different lives, and I don't know which one is real.'" Her voice softens, repeating his words, as if she's still trying to understand them even now. "I didn't know what to say. I mean, we were just kids, you know. At least, that's what I thought at the time. But looking back, I realize now, he wasn't just talking about himself. He was talking about everything. About the way he was seen. The way he had to move through the world, always aware, always thinking about where he fit in. About how people expected him to be one thing or another, but he didn't fully belong to either side." She leans forward slightly, the emotion in her voice becoming more intense. And I think in that moment, I saw a part of him that he didn't show to most people. A part that was tired, that was searching. A part that was already carrying the weight of something so much bigger than himself, even if he didn't fully know it yet. The cafe door opens somewhere in the background, the soft chime of the bell breaking the stillness for just a second. But neither of us react. We're too deep in this moment. "I remember reaching for his hand," she continues, her voice steady but laced with something deeper now. "I told him that he didn't have to figure everything out right then, that maybe it was okay to just be, to stop thinking so much and just live." She shakes her head slightly, a small, almost sad smile tugging at her lips. But that wasn't who he was. He couldn't just exist in the moment, even if he wanted to. He had too much inside him. Too many thoughts, too many questions, and I think, in some ways, he knew. He knew that his life wasn't meant to be simple, that he was always going to be chasing something bigger, something beyond just us. She glances out the window, watching the street lights flicker against the pavement outside. There's something almost distant in her expression now, as if she's still there, walking beside him on that empty street, still hearing the way his voice wavered just slightly when he spoke. "And that's the thing," she says, turning back. "I think part of me always knew too, even when things were good, even when we laughed, when we dreamed about the future like it was something we could shape with our own hands. Deep down, I knew that he wasn't mine to keep, that one day he would belong to the world." She exhales softly, as if saying it out loud makes it more real. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt. The pause that follows is heavy. Unspoken words fill the space between us, the weight of a love that was never meant to last. After a moment, she shakes her head, as if pushing away the emotions threatening to rise. Then, with a small, knowing look, she leans in slightly. "But that's not the whole story," she says, her voice laced with something unreadable. "There's something else. Something I've never told anyone." She hesitates, just for a moment, then glances toward the camera, her expression unreadable. And just like that, the story takes a turn. The air between us shifts. It's subtle, but it's there, something unspoken hanging in the space, thick with the weight of what she hasn't said yet. Her fingers press lightly against the table, as if steadying herself before she speaks again. "There was a night," she says, voice quieter now. "A night that I never really talked about, not to anyone." She looks down for a moment, then exhales, lifting her gaze back up. "We had been distant, not in a way that we fought or anything like that. It was just this feeling, like he was already halfway out the door, even when he was right in front of me." Her fingers trace slow circles on the surface of her cup, her mind clearly back in that moment. "That night, I could feel it more than ever. He wasn't himself. He was distracted, restless. We were sitting in his tiny apartment, barely any furniture, just stacks of books everywhere. He was reading, but I could tell he wasn't actually absorbing anything. He kept flipping pages too fast, his knee bouncing slightly. And then, all of a sudden, he closed the book and looked at me." She stops for a beat, as if replaying that moment in her head. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, just like that. No warning, no explanation, just those words. The cafe noise around us feels distant now, like the world beyond this conversation has faded away. At first, I didn't understand. I thought he meant us, that he was saying it was over. But then I saw his face, really saw it, and I knew this wasn't just about me. This was about something bigger, something he had been carrying alone. She shifts in her seat slightly, her voice becoming more urgent. "He told me he felt like he was standing at the edge of something, like his life was about to take a turn he couldn't undo. That once he stepped forward, there would be no going back, and that scared him. I saw him again, years later, but he never looked back." And just like that, the story ends, not with answers, but with a kind of silence that says everything. She goes quiet for a long moment, her eyes flickering toward the window, as if searching for something she lost a long time ago. The hum of the cafe, the clinking of cups, the low murmur of voices, it all feels distant, like background noise to a story that never really ended. I don't say anything, I just wait, because something tells me she isn't done yet. Then finally, she exhales and turns back to me. "I saw him," she repeats, her voice softer now. "It was years later. I was walking through the city, just another ordinary day. And then, out of nowhere, there he was." She stops, letting the weight of that moment settle. He looked different, of course. More composed, more certain. He carried himself like someone who had long since accepted his place in the world. But I knew it was him. In an instant, I just knew. Her fingers brush against her cup absently, as if grounding herself. "I don't think he saw me. Or maybe he did, and he just chose not to react. But he walked right past me, surrounded by people, all of them hanging on his every word. And I just stood there watching, feeling like I had stepped into someone else's life." She lets out a quiet laugh, one that doesn't quite reach her eyes. "It's funny, isn't it? How you can know someone so intimately, see them in their quietest moments, and then one day, they're a stranger." Her expression shifts slightly, like she's considering whether or not she regrets it. Everything, the past, the choices that led them here. But she doesn't answer that question. Instead, she leans back, letting out another slow breath. "I wanted to stop him," she admits. "To call his name, to ask him if he ever thought about me. About those nights we spent talking, dreaming. About the version of himself he once was." A pause. "But I didn't." She shakes her head slightly, as if she knows that moment was never meant to be rewritten. "Because in the end, that wasn't my place anymore. He had made his choice, and I had made mine. The weight of her words lingers, but there's something else now, something lighter. Maybe acceptance, maybe just the passage of time softening the edges of old wounds. I used to think I needed closure, she continues after a moment, that if I could just understand why he left, why he never looked back, then maybe I could move on. But life doesn't work like that, does it? She offers a small, knowing smile. Some people aren't meant to stay in our lives forever. Some people are just passing through, changing us in ways we don't even realize until much later. She glances at the clock on the wall, as if suddenly aware of the time. She straightens slightly, the shift almost imperceptible, but I can tell, this conversation is coming to an end. I don't regret it, she says finally. Loving him, losing him, all of it, because he was never mine to keep. He belonged to something bigger. And in the end, I think he always knew that. I think I did too. She finishes her coffee, setting the cup down gently. The moment hangs there, suspended between us, before she gives a small nod, almost as if to herself. Anyway, she says with a slight shrug, that's my story. And just like that, she stands, reaching for her coat. There's nothing dramatic about it, no lingering glances or final words meant to tie everything together neatly, because real life isn't like that. Her eyes flicker with something unreadable. And this time, he really was gone. The cafe feels colder now, the world outside moving on as if nothing happened. But between us, the weight of that night lingers. She glances at the camera, her expression unreadable. But that's not the part that keeps me up at night. She pauses, letting the tension stretch, before finally finishing. The part that haunts me is what I found the next morning, and that changed everything. The silence that follows is deafening. She exhales, her fingers pressing against the table as if bracing herself for what comes next. The cafe around us feels distant now, as if the whole world has narrowed down to this moment, to the weight of her words before she even speaks them. The next morning, she finally says, her voice measured but unsteady, I woke up early. I hadn't really slept. I kept hearing his voice in my head, replaying that last conversation over and over. And then, I don't know why, but I had this feeling, like something wasn't right. She stops, her gaze flickering toward the window, as if she's back in that morning, back in the quiet before everything changed. I opened the door to my apartment and there it was. She looks down at her hands, as if the memory itself is something she can still touch. A letter. No name on the front, just placed right there on my doorstep. I knew it was from him the second I saw it. She swallows, her voice dropping lower. I picked it up. My hands were shaking. I took it inside, sat on my couch, and just stared at it for what felt like forever. And then, finally, I opened it. The cafe noise around us has completely faded away now, drowned out by the weight of her story. There wasn't much written, just a few lines, but those lines changed everything. She glances up, locking eyes with me before speaking the words out loud. Asterisk, you were right. I was always standing between two worlds, but now I know which one I belong to. I just hope you'll understand why I had to leave. Asterisk. A long silence stretches between us. She lets out a breath, shaking her head slightly. That was it. No explanation, no goodbye, just that. She leans back in her chair, running a hand through her hair, her expression unreadable. I must have read it 100 times, trying to make sense of it, but I never did. She stops, as if deciding whether or not to say what comes next. Then finally she does. It wasn't until years later, after everything, that I found out the truth. I lean in slightly, barely breathing. He hadn't just disappeared. He hadn't just left town. He had walked away from everything, his old life, his old name, even the people who thought they knew him best. He reinvented himself completely, and he did it so completely that even I didn't recognize him anymore. She lets out a quiet, almost breathless laugh, but there's no humor in it. The man I knew, the man who had been mine, once, he was gone. And in his place was someone the whole world would come to know. Someone who belonged to history now, not to me. She shakes her head, a distant look in her eyes. And that's the thing. The part I never told anyone. The part that still lingers, even after all these years. She leans in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her lips press together briefly, before she continues. I asked him what he meant. I asked him if he was talking about law school, about politics, about whatever it was that had been pulling him away from me, and he just shook his head. He said, "It's not just about what I want anymore. It's about what I have to do." She leans forward slightly now, the intensity in her eyes drawing me in. That was the moment I realized something. He was never just going to be a man who had dreams. He was going to be a man who carried responsibility that went beyond himself. He knew it even then, and I think it terrified him. She pauses, biting her lips slightly, then lets out a soft, almost humorless laugh. I wanted to tell him that he didn't have to do it, that he could choose a different life, one where he didn't have to carry the weight of expectations, of history, of people who would demand more from him than he could ever possibly give. But I didn't, because I think, deep down, I knew he wouldn't have listened. This was who he was, and maybe that was the problem. She exhales slowly, shaking her head. I should have said more that night. I should have asked him if he was sure, if he was ready, if he knew what he was giving up. She looks directly into the camera now, her voice dropping lower. But I didn't, and that's the part that still haunts me. There's a silence, thick and unmoving. Then, finally, she speaks again. The next morning he was gone. And just like that, everything changes. She blinks, as if she can still see it, the morning light creeping through the blinds, the quiet stillness of an empty room. The air feels different now, heavier. She looks down, pressing her lips together for a moment before continuing. I don't mean he was gone like he left town or anything, she says, her voice low, almost as if she's speaking more to herself than anyone else. I mean, he was just gone, like something in him had shifted overnight, like the version of him I knew had disappeared, and in his place was someone else. Someone who had already made up his mind. She lifts her gaze, her expression unreadable. I didn't hear from him that day, or the next, or the next. A pause. And then, out of nowhere, he called. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her cup, her knuckles going pale. It was late. I remember because I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ever hear his voice again, and then the phone rang. She lets out a slow breath, as if she's hearing it all over again. When I picked up, there was silence at first, just breathing. And then finally he said, "I need to see you." She leans forward slightly now, as if the memory itself is pulling her in. There was something in his voice, something I had never heard before, not fear, not sadness. It was urgency, like this was the last chance, like something had already been set in motion, and there was no stopping it. She swallows, her eyes darkening. I told him to come over, and when he showed up at my door, he looked different. Not physically, not really, but in his eyes. It was like he had already left me before he even walked through the door. Her voice lowers, barely above a whisper. I asked him where he'd been, what had happened, but he wouldn't tell me. He just kept saying, "I don't have much time. I need you to understand." She shakes her head slightly, as if she still doesn't fully understand, even after all these years. He told me he was making a choice, that it wasn't about me, that it wasn't even about him, not really. That there were things he couldn't explain, things that were bigger than both of us. A small, bitter smile tugs at the corner of her lips. I asked him if he was in trouble, if he needed help, if there was something, anything I could do. Her fingers gripped the napkin in front of her, twisting it slowly. He just looked at me, for a long time, and then he said, "I don't think we'll see each other again." The words hang there, heavy, final. She exhales sharply, running a hand through her hair. I don't even remember what I said after that. Maybe I begged him to stay. Maybe I just stared at him, hoping he'd change his mind. But he didn't. He kissed me, one last time, and then he left. She starts to walk away, and for a second, I wonder if I should say something. Ask her if she ever wishes she had stopped him that day, if she ever thinks about what might have been. But I don't, because something tells me she's already made peace with the past. As she reaches the door, she hesitates just slightly, then turns back to me one last time. You know, she says, a small smile tugging at her lips, he used to say that the hardest part about chasing a dream is knowing what you have to leave behind. Her eyes hold mine for just a moment longer before she pushes the door open and steps out into the street, disappearing into the crowd. I sit there for a long time after she's gone, her words still echoing in my mind. The hardest part about chasing a dream is knowing what you have to leave behind. Outside, the city keeps moving, people rushing from one place to another, all of them carrying stories of their own. I wonder how many of them have lost someone to a dream. How many of them have had to stand still while someone they loved walked away? The answer, I think, is more than we'll ever know.